I tried this last week. We'll try it again. This is another podcast, and the topic, Dungeons and Dragons. Now you might be saying, well, Fred, you usually talk about Dungeons and Dragons anyway. Well, that's not really true. I do actually change things up, and I have talked about other topics. So yeah, that's my 2 cents in terms of what I do on my channel. Now the topic for today is very different to last week, where I feel like this is far more positive rather than negative. So I'm going to put up a poll. Feel free to take part in that poll. My suggestion to you is grab some food, some drink. I do have notes that I'll be reading from, but I'll do my best to sort of present them in such a way that it's easy to digest, as you might say. And by all means, use the chat to put in your feedback, and I will go through the chat at the end. Anyway, let's get started, shall we? Hi, welcome to How to RPG. My name is Fred Weller, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Today's a little bit different. Today I thought what I would do is I would talk about why I still have hope for Dungeons and Dragons. And I have a lot of hope for Dungeons and Dragons. No matter what game you're playing, okay, I think there's a lot of good things that can come out of what's been taking place, even though it might seem like there aren't a lot of good things coming out of it. So these are the many things that I have listed and taken note myself over the last, I guess, couple of years, but particularly the last year. And these are the things I really wanted to say. There's still plenty of hope for Dungeons and Dragons, in my opinion, because of the numerous factors that affect D&D. And I still love, no matter what I've said, no matter the fact that I've changed the channel name, it's not HowtoDandD anymore, it's HowtoRPG, I still love Dungeons and Dragons. And I likely always will like Dungeons and Dragons, because it's supported by public domain mythology and legend. Quite often, I think we forget that Dungeons and Dragons, so little of it can be copyright or trademarked because it's under public domain. It's been around for hundreds or thousands of years, the mythology and legend of the monsters that we incorporate into our games, play with, even the sorts of characters that we're dealing with. A lot of that is just, somebody can't put a mark on it and say, that belongs to me. And that's one of the great features, particularly when you think about it. Now, when I say Dungeons and Dragons, what I really mean is fantasy tabletop role-playing games. So I want to broadly throw everything into the mix to make it clear. I don't want you to think that I am just saying that it's just D&D and everything is D&D. That's not what I'm saying. I consider Dungeons and Dragons fantasy tabletop role-playings, and almost everything that's come after Dungeons and Dragons, or even before that, is really kind of based off the fantasy concept, our mythology and legend. I've actually fallen out of love with science fiction tabletop role-playing games because of a number of factors, and those are more to do with science fact becoming quite scary, and certainly scarier than science fiction now. So a lot of the things that actually are happening in terms of what we can actually do with science, they're kind of catching up to science fiction. And now I almost feel like I'm living in the Twilight Zone television TV series. That television series, Twilight Zone, just reminds me of just some of the scary things that could potentially happen. Star Wars is still excluded for me in terms of tabletop role-playing games. But when it comes to fantasy and fantasy tabletop role-playing games, they're so outrageous that they have little to no connection to the real world, thankfully, which I really do appreciate. I think that's a great thing. My hope for Dungeons and Dragons and any tabletop role-playing game is the potential for it to change people in a good way. And I'm quite serious about that, and I will explain a little bit more about that. But I've seen some really good things come from people playing tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, and all of the clones and various games that are sort of variations on that. And it brings people together, and that's one of the things I really like about the game. Now, whether you realize it or not, my background is I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and mathematics and philosophy. I have a graduate diploma in higher education, and I have a certificate in counselling. Now, a certificate in counselling doesn't really count for much, okay? It does not mean that I am qualified as a counsellor. I'll make that quite clear. But it does mean that I started that process, all right? So one of the things that I noticed, particularly when I was doing my studies, is that role-playing and also later on tabletop role-playing games have often been used to affect behavior modification or change, to change the way people actually do things. They've been used to develop educational awareness, to improve education, whether that's around mathematics and literacy. It's done a lot of that. And it's also allowed people, particularly to role-playing, whether you're role-playing in a fantasy world or you're just role-playing a situation that you find difficult in the real world, it allows people to help change their or alter their attitude. And it's been used in the field of counseling for a very long time. That's just the role-playing aspect. When we go to tabletop role-playing games, it's just a tool for counselors to use in a way to sort of engage people and to make them a bit more interested. And you can address a lot of really interesting and, I guess, sensitive topics. So Dungeons and Dragons has this great opportunity to allow people to practice actually fighting and resisting prejudice in the game. Things like racism and sexism, ageism, which is often overlooked, tyranny and slavery. Big one for me is tyranny and slavery, okay? I know the big ones nowadays are always being touted as being racism and sexism, but ultimately what they boil down to is tyranny and slavery. And you can do this in a safe way in a tabletop role-playing game. Dungeons and Dragons allows you to do that. And this is a very good thing. And whether you realize it or not, if you have been paying attention, not necessarily to your news outlets and to your politicians or anything like that, but if you actually pay attention to what's going on in the world, you'll soon discover that the game that you play, okay, and how it works has a lot of connections to the real world. Slavery is still a thing that exists today, right now. For those of you who are wondering, slavery exists today in every country around the world, whether that is the people trafficking trade for prostitution, drugs, everything else, sweatshops, indentured servitude is a thing. Indenturement is an actual thing. People wind up in these. This is essentially slavery. Okay, there may be a contract written and somebody might have signed it, but it's essentially saying you've just given away most of your life to pay out this huge debt. And we just don't see slavery in our world. And so that frustrates me when I see publishers trying to ignore slavery in Dungeons and Dragons and their tabletop role-playing games, because this is one thing we can definitely address, and we can do it in a safe manner without having to worry about somebody trying to attack us physically, throwing bricks through a window, things like that, and attacking us on social media, or literally going after us and making us one of the targets for this. So this is one of the things that I really like the idea of looking at. But in the end, even though there's all the serious stuff that I'm saying that you can address in Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games, ultimately in the end, Dungeons and Dragons boils down to fighting, bribing, negotiating with monsters for treasure. It's still the Dungeons and Dragons adventure quest goal. That's it. In a very broad sense. And when I say monsters, I don't just mean monsters in terms of the strange alien creatures that we come across. What I mean is the strange and crazy individuals that might be our big bad villain, and they might just be human. There are monsters out there that are human, and so they are still part of the whole package. I've also realized that given the things that have taken place in the last year and a little bit longer, and also sort of looking more at how the community sort of works nowadays, Dungeons and Dragons will survive whatever happens to the company that owns the intellectual property for D&D. And why is that? Because of the Creative Commons. Like, they've put Dungeons and Dragons 5e into Creative Commons version 4. There's no going back from that. Okay, there's nothing you can do. There's no point trying to go to court. You can't get creative with it. It's there. And in the essence of D&D 5e, there are so many mechanics and concepts that are in there that are related to older versions of Dungeons and Dragons that you've kind of covered a lot of your bases. Mechanically, you still have the attack roll. You still have saving throws. You still have ability checks, and you have skill checks. There's 4 different mechanics and a raft of other things, and they've all been put into Creative Commons. And then we have the open game license. Like the open game license, we had always assumed, or a lot of us have assumed, that would protect D&D from, I guess, exploitation, but more the ability for everybody to share their stuff and make the game a lot broader, because there was a time when D&D had a very good chance of simply disappearing. Like, the only thing you might be able to find is some old books on it, but it's kind of been hardened from and protected now, because a lot of that old publication stuff has gone onto PDF and is now available on the internet. Now we're just dependent on making sure that those sites actually keep making it available to you, even if you can't buy the physical book. At one time, Wizards of the Coast, a few years back, when Mike Mills was in charge of the company, they actually republished all of the older versions of the game. Now, they don't do that now. I wish they did do that, but they don't do it now, which is a shame. But we also have third-party publishers. Third-party publishers have really done a great job of using the Creative Commons and the Open Game License to keep Dungeons and Dragons alive in different versions and different iterations. And the fact that you can't copyright game mechanics is very important. Like, the game mechanics themselves, if we were worried about D&D in terms of the game mechanics, you don't have to worry about them, because you can't copyright them. There's no point going into court and fighting about it. The only thing you can fight about is how the exact wording of how you present your rule. That's it. And a slight change, and it's there's only so many different ways you can communicate the same rule, right? And whatever the rule might be for a game mechanic, there's only so many different ways you can communicate that. So it's really not a big issue. There's another factor that I think a lot of people forget, is you can't copyright generic fantasy. As I just mentioned before, like, generic fantasy is not something you can put a copyright on. If your dragon is so similar to the generic public domain and mythology and legend that exists out there, it's not really copyrightable, because you have to make enough changes for it to be warranted as being different from that. Just the simple word dragon is not copyrightable. The simple concept of a dragon is not copyrightable. So it's kind of protected in that way. And if you've been paying attention a while back, you might have seen Ryan Dancy talking about the Open Game License. And Ryan Dancy's made it clear that the Open Game License for Dungeons and Dragons, particularly version 3 and 3.5, but now 5e, can't be revoked. The Open Game License version 1.0a is not a revocable license, even though a lot of people would like to think that it is. It can't be deauthorized. It can't be ended. It can't be cancelled. It's there. And I think it's become clear, even though it hasn't gone to court, I think it's clear at this present time to those people who do have the intellectual property of Dungeons and Dragons right now, that taking it to court to try to revoke it or deauthorize it would result in them failing. Now, if they were to fail this, that might actually cause more problems, because they might open themselves up even more than they had before. Because there are so many things attached to Dungeons and Dragons that Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro probably don't want people to realize aren't actually under copyright. And that's a bit of a problem, right? If somebody was actually willing to pay the money to fight it in court, how difficult would it be to prove? And is there somebody willing to do it? And I think it's become clear that there is at least a couple of companies willing to band together to take them on if they wanted to try and do that. And you might say, but Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro are so big that they'll just tie them up in court for years and years and years. I don't think that's actually the case. So I see hope in that as well. I don't need to think about it legally as being a problem. Now, the survival. People have talked about the survival of Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, and will that mean, if they go down, will Dungeons and Dragons go down? And I think it's pretty clear that whether Wizards of the Coast gets into trouble or Hasbro gets into trouble, this will not determine if Dungeons and Dragons continues into the future. Why? Well, one, because I think Wizards of the Coast could probably survive without Hasbro quite nicely. But let's not talk about that sort of thing. I think the important thing to realize is third-party publishers. The smaller publishers, these are publishers that you would think were more likely to go out of business than somebody like Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro. Okay, or if they were to make a false step and make a mistake. But here's the thing. Wizards of the Coast is embracing third-party publishers on their website D&D Beyond now. Now, they're obviously the very big publishers, and they're obviously selecting books that have been published that have done extremely well, and now they're available there, and Wizards of the Coast will benefit from that, but so will the third-party publishers as well. So that's a great thing. Another thing that's happened, a rather odd thing, is that third-party publishers have done such a marvelous job. They've kind of fortified D&D to a point where it can't be lost easily because there's so many versions of it. So to give you an example, when Wizards of the Coast made Dungeons and Dragons 4E, a lot of people really wanted to play that game. But as Dungeon Masters came in and tried to run that game, they realized that it was actually very easy to run, but later on it became like a nightmare. And so fewer and fewer tables were running that game, and fewer books were being purchased, even though the book production was huge. So this allowed Paizo Publishing to actually create Pathfinder using the open game license based off Dungeons and Dragons version 3 and 3.5. And Pathfinder is essentially Dungeons and Dragons. Let's get real. That's what it is. It's just a clone, okay? And it exists there, and there's nothing you can do about it. Wizards of the Coast knows this. Hasbro knows it. There's nothing they can do about Pathfinder. This also creates some problems for Paizo because they can't state that it's their intellectual property in many respects because of the open game license. They're using that license. Now, they made a lot of changes to Pathfinder 2nd edition, but it's still at its very core is Dungeons and Dragons. And then we have Kobold Press, who've seen the Creative Commons version 4 come out for 5e, and the fact that it's under open game license as well, that they're probably going to use, I would imagine they're probably going to use the Creative Commons version 4. Kobold Press is creating a game called Tales of the Valiant. Tales of the Valiant is just another version of Dungeons and Dragons 5e. That's it. So you now have another game, another publisher, printing essentially the same game with just a few minor tweaks as far as I'm concerned, which a lot of people have sort of hassled Kobold Press for, but it's actually quite smart. And if we have another publisher who's just basically publishing the Creative Commons version 5 of D&D, like I said, most of it is there. That most of the game is in 5e anyway, in some way. You can take out stuff, you can put stuff in, but it's mostly there. Yeah. I think the only thing that isn't in there is some of the D6 resolution mechanics in terms of rules, but again, you can't copyright them. And the percentile dice checks that they used to have are not in 5e. Again, it's a game rule, so it's not really something you can copyright. So you could incorporate it if you really wanted to. And then we have MCDM. Matthew Colville Distracts Me. This company has made, starting to make a game system, and whether you like that game system or not, it's essentially Dungeons and Dragons. You might, obviously they're not going to use the name Dungeons and Dragons, but They'll call it something else, of course, like everybody does. But it's essentially Dungeons & Dragons 4E remastered. It's what D&D 4E would have looked like if they had gone further down that road than they did. And that's what Matthew Colville and his team are doing. So again, we've got another system that's going to be out there. It's a clone. We have the Arcane Library. Kelsey has got Shadow Dark, which is essentially a combination, a mutation of 5e and basic D&D. And there's many others keeping Dungeons and Dragons alive. The OSR has got, old school essentials. There's your Dungeon Crawl Classics. You've got Tunnels and Trolls, for those of you who might be aware of it. These are all really inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. Essentially the same game, fundamentally, in terms of the concept of you explore, you work together as a team, you fight monsters, or you deal with monsters, or you trick monsters, and you accumulate power and treasure, and you complete goals and quests. You do adventuring, you do that sort of stuff. So I think there's a lot to be said for the fact that because we have that there, and because all these publishers are finding ways to make that work for them, and there are more continuing to do that right now, and there will be into next year, and there will be into many years from now, I think that's going to really help keep D&D alive and healthy in some way. Many people who are veterans, so if you're a veteran to Dungeons & Dragons, maybe you started off with the original game or basic D&D or AD&D, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or even if you're new and your first game was Pathfinder 2nd Ed Edition or Shadow Dark or Dungeons & Dragons 5e, like veterans and new people are incorporating homebrew core rules into the things that they do at their table. And they're not just doing it with homebrew rules and core rules. They're doing it with adventures and monsters that they make. They're doing it with magic items they create and races they are creating. We're doing a lot of this stuff on my channel right now, but it's not just me on my channel. It's everybody. People are making classes, not just subclasses, not just something you tack on, but the entire class, making feats for the game. Now, even if this is for Dungeons & Dragons 5e, whether you realize it or not, there are people still making supplements and add-ons and additional things for older versions of Dungeons & Dragons. Whether that is basic BECME D&D or AD&D. Sometimes they're publishing it, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're making money off it, sometimes they're not. But it's still out there, it's still floating around. And it's becoming more and more of a thing. And that is to be expected. As the number of people playing the game play for longer, they start doing more and more of their own stuff. And this happens right down to teenagers. I've heard stories of teenagers who are playing in space. Their campaign has gone into space, and they've never heard of Spelljammer. They've never bought a book from Wizards of the Coast or TSR that had anything to do with space. They just taken their D&D game there. Anyone can now publish material or digital books on the internet, even physical books if you wanted to. There's print on demand for Dungeons & Dragons, and at very little cost to them if they don't include too much art. Art is always the prohibitive aspect. Time is a valuable resource, but it's something that most people can do alongside their day job or in their spare time, quite often because they're probably already doing it anyway. Yeah, some people it won't be the case for sure. But you can publish stuff, and you don't have to publish a book that's 300 or 400 pages long. You can publish a book or a supplement that's 5 pages long or 10 pages long. It's much more manageable. And that can be done by anybody, and you do not need to be an incorporated company necessarily. You could just do that as a sole trader or just a sole creator. Now, there is always that question, and I'm going to say this is probably just a little bit of a twist. I said this was going to be positive in terms of Dungeons & Dragons. This is still positive, but there is a little bit of a drop off, okay, because you'll see what I mean. When Wizards of the Coast tries to re-release Dungeons and Dragons after a different game, under a different game license, not an open game license, when? It's not if Wizards of the Coast will do this, it's when. Okay? After Dungeons and Dragons version 3 or 3.5, the management of that company understood that the game itself was not the asset, that the asset was the community. It's the Dungeons and Dragons community, because everybody was playing a different game. Not just 3.5 or version 3 back then. They were playing AD&D, first ed edition, second ed edition, basic, original, and everybody liked their version of the game. And some of them were kit bashing it to, like, they were playing something else. So once that happened, Wizards of the Coast realized that they wanted to have a bit more control over things. They wanted to have a bit more ownership. And I think every time management changes and we get a new release of a new version of the game, even if they say it hasn't actually changed, we have management sort of look at, well, how can we deal with the open game license? So under 4E, we got a different license, and it didn't work. Now, there's a lot of different reasons why 4E didn't work, but it didn't work, I would say, primarily because it wasn't under an open game license. It might have been far more successful. Paizo would not have created Pathfinder. Paizo would have still been publishing under 4E if it was an open game license, but it wasn't. They changed it. That actually killed themselves pretty efficiently. When 5E came along, they'd already made that mistake, and management coming in were realizing that they thought, like, D&D was in such a lot of trouble near the end of the 4E lifespan. Pathfinder was dominating, and D&D was almost non-existent in all of my friends' circles. Nobody was playing it in New Zealand. I don't know what it was like in North America or your part of the world, but it was almost gone. So when they brought back the open game license for 5E, that really did help. There's lots of other factors that came into play, and we could see what happened when Wizards of the Coast decided to bring out a new version of the game, or an alteration, whether you call it Dungeons and Dragons 5E or 5.5 or version 6, or it's not a change, it's just the same thing. They were bringing it out under a different game license. You could see it wasn't going to work. It was a disaster. So it doesn't matter if Wizards of the Coast tries to do this again, because they will be new management, but it's not going to be successful. So we don't need to worry about that sort of thing. Even if there's an outcry, publishers will dry up. They'll be the only one publishing it. Like when Wizards of the Coast was publishing Dungeons and Dragons 5e, they were primarily the only ones making stuff, and they made a lot of stuff, and they didn't make any money. So having, sole ownership of it didn't really solve their problems, and if anything, it hurt them immensely. Now, playing Dungeons and Dragons in person is one of my favorite things to do. Playing with family is definitely high up on my list, but playing Dungeons and Dragons with friends, really, really helpful. I've always enjoyed that. Okay, my favorite one is with family, but with friends is good enough. And strangers, I'm less keen on nowadays, but I have done it. But the great thing about playing Dungeons and Dragons with your family, your friends, and strangers is it brings people together in a wonderful collective experience. It kind of really helps define relationships, your connection. It helps you develop a level of patience. It helps do a lot of different things. And I feel like it makes you feel like you're much closer to them than you were before. Now, we could be going off and just having a barbecue or getting drunk at a party, doing something else rather than playing Dungeons and Dragons. But one of the great things about D&D is it forces you to communicate with other people. And that's what I really like. It's the fact that it brings people together. And there are very few things that do that very well. And there's always going to be problems, of course, but at least it's attempting to do so. The fundamental concept of it is definitely trying to do that. Even the online video call or video platform games, when you can see somebody in a video chat It's not quite the same as being in person, but it still has the potential to do something similar. And I've been playing with my own personal friends for a while now online. We've been doing this because of the pandemic. We haven't stopped because a lot of the issues that exist still exist. They just don't print the stats and the numbers in New Zealand anymore about what's going on. But most of us know what's going on. So we've decided to keep, and also a lot of us have moved away. You know, when you move away from your friends, but you still want to play with them, you know, using Zoom or you know, some sort of video chat is going to kind of be your go-to. So I still think that's definitely a usable technique. I'm not a fan of a virtual tabletop and just hearing people talk. I want to be able to see them. It's what really drives me, and I think that's really useful. Dungeons and Dragons is one of the few games that actually rewards but also requires you to cooperate with somebody else. When you play this game, you have to cooperate. All the players playing a character, you have to cooperate to be successful, to achieve and move forward. If you don't do that, you won't get very far. It will crumble. Your game, your campaign will crumble. Most games are competitive, where whether you play Monopoly or chess, whether you're playing Snakes and Ladders or checkers, all of those games, they're all about winning against somebody else, about beating the other person. And there's got to be a winner and there's got to be a loser. That's it. But in Dungeons and Dragons, they're really not necessarily going to work that way. Now, you might be thinking, yes, but Fred, you haven't considered the players' characters. The players are actually playing against the Dungeon Master. It's not really like that. And if you think that way, you've probably lost, you haven't been paying attention. Or you're playing a very different game. Maybe what you're still trying to do is play chess rather than Dungeons and Dragons. And maybe that works for you, but that's not really where Dungeons and Dragons was trying to go. Do you know what I mean? So that's where my head is at. Unfortunately, I would say the majority of the world still views competition as the natural norm of the natural world. And that is a relic of the Neanderthal part of the human brain. Our human brain has got some bits that are quite capable of advancing and doing a lot more than it does right now. And I'm sure in the hundreds and thousands of years that we have hopefully left to develop, that will come about. But there's still that Neanderthal part of our brain working that sort of has this strange view, probably because we've never experienced anything else. And when you have never experienced anything else, you just assume that what you have now is the only thing that will ever exist. Just as our ancestors probably assumed that the feudal system was the only way that anything could probably ever exist and work. And how when we had the master and the slave system, that they assumed that that was the only way it could naturally work. And now we have the capitalist system, which is only slightly different from the feudal system. But, you know, I really feel like that Dungeons and Dragons is moving into we are all part of the same ecosystem. We are all connected in some way, and what we do together is really important. And when somebody else benefits, then everybody should benefit from this in some way. Because by making sure that everybody else benefits, there's an opportunity for somebody else to do something great with that and expand things, to move things forward. And getting along with people is really important. I think this is underestimated by a lot of people in terms of how important it is to be able to get along with the people that you are around. Now, even if the current version of Dungeons and Dragons that is being developed by Wizards of the Coast, that's being released this year, even if it's not for me, which I feel like it probably isn't, even if it's not for you, everybody's going to keep playing the version of Dungeons and Dragons, the game that they prefer, whether that be original, basic, AD&D, version 3, 4, or 5, okay? Or the new 5, whatever that's supposed to be, 5.5. Was that 2024 D&D? I mean, whatever you want to call it. It won't matter. I mean, in the end, whether a company calls something a particular name, unfortunately for companies, when you give it a name and you're trying to do something to avoid losing sales, the community will always pick the name for you, and there's not much you can do about that. That's just how it works. There's a lot of choice out there, not just in older versions of D&D, but the newer versions of D&D and the variants and the clones. And of course, as I said, the heavily house-ruled and home-brewed game, which is becoming more and more popular and probably continues to become more and more popular. So there is a lot of hope for Dungeons & Dragons. I don't think we need to concern ourselves about the existence of D&D. In fact, if anything, I suspect that we will find it will be hardened against any future tampering and any potential loss. Really, the only thing that could threaten it is people deciding that they don't want to use their imagination anymore. That's probably the only thing that could possibly hurt it. So I hope this was interesting and useful to you, but I hope that this sort of at least alleviated some of your fears if you ever had some, or confirmed what you already thought. But even if it doesn't, it really doesn't matter. This is just my opinion. I want to thank all of my patrons who support me on Patreon. I do appreciate it. I want to thank everybody who's been watching and listening. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s. Well, I'm not gone. We're going to go through the chat. So there is something in development. I see Mr. Welsh is still here. How are you, everybody? I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that covered the things that you thought I needed to say. But even if it didn't, it's really where my head was at, and I wanted to talk about it. So I know I've done a lot of talking for the last almost 40 minutes. This happens. Remember, I used to do this a lot on a Friday in New Zealand, and now I'm doing it now. So let's have a look at the chat. I want to say right now, you are going to see on YouTube very shortly, and I said to Glenn, Mr. Welsh, that I wasn't going to say anything about it until it was actually happening. Before, I wasn't going to say anything about what is going to wind up happening until it was ready to be seen. But you will see a video on Mr. Welsh's channel very shortly. A video unlike any video you've probably ever seen in your life. And I don't expect that many people will watch it. I really don't. I would like to think that they would, but it's probably not going to happen. But I would encourage you when you see it, and you'll know what I'm talking about when you see it, I would encourage you to go and watch that video. It will be very long, very long. But maybe this will help you get to grips with a lot of stuff, because it's been a remarkable endeavor, frankly, a completely remarkable endeavor. And I thank Glenn organising it. And when you get to see it, I look forward to seeing your reactions, those of you who do watch it. Okay, so Fred Huber said here, tabletop role-playing games will continue. And do you know, I mean, tabletop games have existed before D&D, just in different versions and different iterations. The tabletop role-playing game actually goes further back. Even the role-playing game itself goes further back. I actually spent some of my time doing LARP, that's live action role-playing. For those of you who don't like live role, live role action stuff, that's fine. If you just want to sit at a table, it's cool. I did it when I was younger, when I could deal with all the bruises, and I had an entire day to run around in a forest, smacking people with rubber foam swords and throwing beanbags at people. And I won't even explain that. And running around in monster masks, which of course we did a lot of. But it's a fun time, you know. It definitely feels like you're going back to being a kid. And it's one of the great things about D&D is that I kind of get to recapture. You get to recapture being a kid for a bit, with all the crazy stuff that you have to deal with in the real world as an adult. That's one of the great things about it. Anyway, the name of the game is Change. The adventures will be much the same. They may well be. They may change a little bit, but I think essentially they are the same, as I mentioned. Overboard, hi Joe, as a moderator. Thank you for being here. We've got D&D Homebrew. Interesting stuff, Fred. Hello, Kevin. Nice to have you here. Kevin does a YouTube channel as well, and so does Overboard, actually. Pale Rider, I applied to be a sensitivity reader. They never called me back. Oh, well, Pale Rider, I mean, maybe it's just not your calling. Maybe it'll be something else. For those of you who are enjoying this, I'm probably going to do a podcast where I'm going to go back to what I used to do in the past, where I do one video a week. But I'm not going to do one video a week, but I will at least talk to a topic. Okay? Normally it would take me an entire week to prepare all this sort of stuff, but I will go back to doing that sort of thing. Leonard Orth is a moderator and a patron. Hello, Leonard. How are you doing? Greetings. Thanks for being here. Mr. Welsh also has a YouTube channel, as I mentioned. You've got to keep an eye on his channel because there's something coming very, very shortly. You want to watch that if you can. I hired a bunch of insensitivity readers. Hate clickers sell better. Yes, I guess hate clickers do sell better. And it's funny how that works, but you're probably right. Hasbro will sell licenses. Yes, Hasbro will sell licenses. They've done that in the past. They'll continue to do that. But that's really unimportant about whether Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro is selling licenses. Do you know what I mean? I want to reiterate the fact that Dungeons and Dragons can survive all this. Hello, Dungeons and Chronics. Just because there are so many things that are part of D&D that we think belong to Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, and it doesn't. The rule mechanics don't belong to them because you can't copyright them. A lot of the rules that you see actually go back to original D&D or basic D&D. Different types of mechanics you see in games, they all go back to that, but you still can't copyright it. Does anybody realize that the boulet, the boulette, the bullet, the land shark is not copyrighted by Wizards of the Coast? They would like you to think it is, but it's not. It doesn't belong to them. It belongs to Tim Kask. There was a time where people would make monsters for the game, and they would present them to Dungeon Magazine and Dragon Magazine, but I think it was Dungeon Magazine mostly. And they would have a monster that they would create, and then, of course, you would incorporate it into your game. But quite often, TSR back then never paid for the rights for those monsters. People retained ownership of them. So Tim Kask still has the rights to the boulet, not Wizards of the Coast. Isn't that surprising? Isn't that a shock to the system? When it comes to dragons, you can't copyright dragons. They go way, way back in our history in terms of mythology and legend. You can't copyright that. The Yeti is not a copyrightable monster. You can't copyright that thing. A lot of the things that you would want to copyright, I mean, you could say, yes, that the Forgotten Realms is copyright. Yes, it is. Made by Ed Greenwood. He doesn't own the copyright for it anymore. He sold it. But is that the biggest selling point for Dungeons and Dragons? I just don't think it is. I know a lot of people like using that world, but you'd be fine being able to play D&D without the Forgotten Realms or Eberron, since again, Baker doesn't own Eberron either. He creates a lot of content for it, but he doesn't own it. You can't own the Boogeyman. You just can't own that. It's not something you can own. So anybody can do whatever the heck they like with it. It's only a matter of time before a lot of the written materials for Dungeons and Dragons will eventually wind up in the public domain. And then Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro will have to figure out how to make money doing something else, which they will have. They'll use licensing. They'll use licensing on something else. You just republish something else, that you create something. If you can create something that hasn't been created before, that has got a name and it's easily identifiable, then you can copyright that. So they've got to create something new. They can't just rely on all the other stuff they've done in the past. So that's really important too to remember. There are so many monsters like that in D&D that we associate as being theirs. Tiamat. Tiamat is not something that belongs to Wizards of the Coast. The name itself goes back much further than Wizards of the Coast or TSR. Okay, their version of Tiamat maybe, but their version of Tiamat is actually pretty close to what the original one is. It's not that far removed. Something like your goblin. The goblin is not really a copyrightable monster. Even the orc. The orc is a bit of a problem in terms of copyright. The fairy, the pixie. These aren't really copyrightable things. Ghosts, you can't copyright a ghost. A zombie is not something you could copyright. I could go on and on and on, but you get my point. You'll discover that so many things. The Mind Flayer, which is copyrighted by Wizards of the Coast, is simply a complete photocopy of the Illithid from Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu had the Illithid in it. Very similar in what it looks like in its appearance, and in some cases, how it even functions. That's under public domain. You may not be able to use the word Mind Flayer, but you can say Illithid. So, and it's essentially the same. So it's, yeah, I'm just going to keep pointing that out. Anyway, I'm going to end this poll. I think this is probably good enough for today. I am going to try to bring you a new topic next week. I haven't decided what that will be. I've been writing a couple of them, and I haven't come to a conclusion as to which one I would like to discuss. And I will do that when I get a chance, okay? Do you have hope for Dungeons & Dragons? This is the poll. Yes, out of 17 votes, 64%. No, 17%. Can I assure you, those of you who put down no, that you don't have any hope for Dungeons & Dragons, that you really don't need to concern yourself. It's going to be perfectly fine. It's going to be perfectly fine. Undecided, 17%. Again, you don't need to concern yourself. It is going to be all right in the end. No matter how much people sell you the fact that, you know, the day is coming when all hell will break loose and the game will no longer exist and you'll have to hang on to those last few books. No, it's never going to come. It's never going to come. As long as people want to play imagination games, they'll keep doing it. And surprisingly, in an age of digital games, there are more people trying to play that sort of game than there ever have been. How is that possible? In an age of video games, there are more people trying to play tabletop D&D than there ever has. I mean, did they really have the records back then to actually indicate how many people actually play the game? Even today, do they really know how many people play the game? All I know is that the community in my country, in New Zealand, is continuing to grow, and I can see that through the Facebook group that is managed by Andre and the moderators that working under Andre. This group that I started was just a collection of my friends on Facebook. I don't know if that's working the same way for everybody else around the world, but I still think it's a good move. It's in a positive direction. We'll be all right. It'll be fine. Anyway, I am finished for today. I'm going to get out of here and let you get on with your day. I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's been watching and listening. I do appreciate it. I know a live stream is not necessarily the most watchable thing for a lot of people because it's long form content. I get it. I want to thank all of my patrons. I want to thank everybody who took part in the poll today. And yeah, buck up. It's all going to be good. So wherever you are in the world, whether it be the morning, the afternoon, or the night, please look after yourself, your family, and your friends. Be nice to your neighbours. Keep playing Dungeons and Dragons if you like playing Dungeons and Dragons. It doesn't necessarily have to be the exact Dungeons and Dragons that you're used to thinking of. Remember, Dungeons and Dragons is just a fantasy tabletop role-playing game. That's all it is. And until next time, keep rolling those 20s.